factors research methods that go into collecting data, but I do want to talk a little up front about best practices. From there, we'll kind of go into the details, the nitty-gritty of analyzing qualitative data, which can be a little more time-consuming and a little more gray, if you will, as far or ambiguous compared to the quantitative analyses that some of us might be more used to. Then we'll talk about how you report and convey those insights that you gain from analyzing your data, and how you kind of talk to others in companies, other stakeholders, about the findings, the conclusions, and the recommendations that your data yield. Excuse me. So we'll start getting your bearings. So qualitative data is not exclusive to early stage research. Obviously, it occurs throughout the entirety of the human factors process. But today, we're really going to be focusing on ethnographic research, which differs in this case from contextual inquiry based on the researcher role. So ethnography is a little bit longer format. It tends to be more observational, where you're sort of a shadow in the background, whereas contextual inquiry is more of an interview in the space in which certain use cases occur. So just to get everybody on the same page, I think that language is extremely important when we're talking about data. And so I wanted to sort of lead by example here, and just so you know what I'm referring to when I use certain terms. So when I say data, I'm talking about raw data, so multiple pieces of information that you get from research in order to answer the questions that you and your colleagues and other stakeholders may have posed. But when we talk about findings are more data that you've concatenated in one way or another that describe what the researchers observed, what happened actually during your study. And then insights and conclusions are the determinations that are made based on the data and the findings. These are the so what. It's, well, we found that this many nurses did, X task very quickly. Then what does that mean? So the conclusions are sort of actionable insights here. And then finally, design choices or recommendations are ideas that you may have based on your conclusions that you can kind of use to start a discussion with other stakeholders as you go through the product design process. So, computer is not responding. Okay. So just a little quick note on best practices. Conclusions drawn from both qualitative and quantitative data tend to involve moderate subjectivity. And this is not something that a lot of data scientists always discuss, but I think that it's important to note that this is expert opinion in some ways, and there's a lot of different ways we can go about this, but the important thing is being transparent. So in no way are my takes on this or my opinions or my training here fully exhaustive, but I do think that my experience leads me to be in a good place to talk about how I got to my conclusions and how to treat data in a way that's, sort of ethically sound, treat data with integrity, and really make sure that you're doing the best thing for your users and your company. So in analyses, again, be clear about how you got to the conclusions that you've drawn. And this sort of thing can be really helpful, especially when you're bringing this to people who might push back on your findings or your recommendations. I think that it allows for a much more productive discussion following, let's say, a report presentation. So, some of the qualitative data in early research that you might find, so let's say we're doing ethnography or contextual inquiry, you'll find a lot of environmental or contextual factors. So what are the influences of the space or the use environment on the system that you're looking to design or redesign? Other qualitative data might involve something more subjective, emotional responses to an existing device or system, how likable something is, how trustworthy it is. So really user perceptions here. Moreover, things like current workflows. What are the orders in which tasks are typically done, and how much does that vary across users? And then how does that differ from maybe an expected workflow that you might have? As well, efficiency gaps or opportunities within those workflows. So is there something about that workflow that you can identify as maybe less than ideal that could be redesigned or reimagined to facilitate faster and safer use? Tips and tricks and workarounds are always a fun one. I think especially healthcare professionals will have these for you. Nurses are a great treasure trove of workarounds that you can actually bring into your design. And then journey maps and personas, as well as maybe something like adverse events, maybe from a mod database perspective as well. And that is, again, it's not an exhaustive list, but I think that's a lot of what we focus on when we're collecting. So today, I think it would be best for us to really ground things in a, we'll say, hypothetical reality here, but to use more concrete examples, because I think that discussions on data can tend to be very sort of high up, sort of in the clouds, and I think to bring them down, we're going to be grounding them with a little bit of a hypothetical case study here. So we'll say the case study is ethnographic research. It's for a high precision handheld surgical tool that might be operated by 3 different user groups. So we'll say a vascular surgeon, a surgical assist, and then either a scrub tech or a circ nurse supporting in the OR. We'll say that we're collecting data for a next-gen product so that we do have some predicate devices out there on the market that are widely available in the US. So as I said, I kind of want to go through a higher level overview of collecting qualitative data. So what qualitative data do we collect? For something like this, we'd go through probably and do a little bit of desk research up front, use the mod database, which is a great resource for complaints and reports for things that are already out there, whether it's your system or your competitors. System location and arrangements. Once we get into, let's say we go into the OR and we're standing there, you might sketch down the environment, make sure that you understand some of the commonalities in the space that might limit or facilitate your system's functioning. Workflow and order of operations, tasks carried out by each of the 3 users. So who's doing what? You know, are they sterile? Are they non-sterile? And what does this mean for some of the design features that you're going to implement? Quotations and opinions, as well as observing for ergonomic compatibility. Does anybody struggle with anything? Are handles and heights appropriate sizes? Are they bending a lot? You want to make sure that, especially in the OR environment, that we're trying to facilitate healthy interactions here as well as usable. And then anything taken outside the workflow is great to note, but only if it's going to affect the device or system. There's a lot going on in the OR, and I think that a lot of times I see reports or I've heard people discuss things that were going on simultaneously, but that may not have actually affected the system. And so if you can pare down your data to really what matters, I think that's going to be of a big benefit once you get to the reporting stage. So how do we go about collecting these things? As I said, you start with desk research in a lot of cases, just really kind of trying to use YouTube videos or the mod database to understand what might be about to happen and familiarize yourself with the space if it's not something with which you're already familiar. Photography during sessions, whether in market research facilities or in the OR, is always a good idea. If you can take hundreds and hundreds of photos, it's going to be a little bit less time consuming than going through videos. But video is key, especially for capturing audio, quotations, and conversations that occur during the procedures or during the use of the system. Observational notes, typed or handwritten. If you can write down or jot down things, whether it's on a moderation guide or some sort of research notebook, that's great, because anything that you're thinking in the moment, you might not remember, 3 hours from now, let alone 2 weeks from now when you've finished your observations and are back in the office. And then if, there's some places, there's some places where you can't get permission to video or take photos because of PHI, participant data, anything like that. And so in order to respect that privacy, oftentimes you can ask to bring in an audio recording to make sure that you do capture some of those longer quotes and get transcripts and verbatims that you might need to leverage when thinking about qualitative user perceptions. And then another thing that I think sometimes we forget is that the device may have a log in and of itself. And especially in early stages, when you're trying to figure out what happened or why something went wrong, these logs can be exceptional for recording error states and sort of telling you what's happening in the system at a given time point. And sort of what that might mean. You can compare it to the behavioral data that you collect at that same time. And then lastly, if you can't get everything, and sometimes you just can't, pre and post-session interviews, if the physicians or HCPs have time, are very valuable in understanding user perceptions as well. And you can type those, again, handwritten data, type up notes in an Excel or OneNote, anything like that. And it's important, really, you can go in and collect all these data, but your data collection isn't going to be targeted unless you ask the right questions. So even at the early stages of research, it's important to keep in mind who wants to know what. So you may be in the generative stages, things might be very up in the air, but talk to people, talk to designers, think about what the FDA is eventually going to want to know, critical tasks, things like that. Talk to your marketing team, talk to engineers or executives and see what is it that you're hoping to get out of this. Because as a usability or human factors researcher, we may have our own priorities as far as errors and safety, but making sure that at the beginning you're taking into account a lot of people's priorities can really help you to structure your data. And it's important that you ask those right questions at the right time, which is before you go in. Don't try to collect everything, come back, and then pick and choose based on the feedback that you get. Really try to prepare yourself before you go in so that you know what questions you want to be asking in your interviews or what things are important to note during procedures, for instance. And there are also great ways to collaborate more officially before you go in. So for instance, FDA protocol reviews, even for ethnography, task analyses with designers. You can do brainstorms with your marketing team or discuss requirements with engineers. Maybe something's not feasible or there's been a problem they've been looking to address with manufacturing that you can go and get data on. And really sort of talk about budget expectations as well. So, how long can this go on? What is the company willing to put out there in order to facilitate your research and your expertise? It doesn't look like I have control here. 1 second. There we go. Okay. So it's also important to think of the output. So how is it that you plan on communicating the data? You can see over on the right-hand side of the screen here, there's this, inevitable circle, sort of this infinite relationship between your collection and your reporting. One informs the other and vice versa. And so think about, are you just going to be, taking data in an Excel spreadsheet and turning it into a dashboard? Are you using a Word doc or a PowerPoint, something really highly visual, or are you even going to do some concept modeling? I think that this will tell you, so for an Excel spreadsheet, you might lean more towards organized quotations and divvying things up into tasks. If you're looking at a PowerPoint, you might think, okay, I need to take more photos. I need to take a sort of a B-roll for some aesthetically pleasing elements as well. So I think that it's never too early to think about reporting, and it's never too early to collaborate with others who might also have a stake in this. Okay. So for today's case study collection example, maybe if we're going into the OR, before we go in, we sit down and we look at the mod and we say, okay, here are some of the user needs and some of the pain points. Here are some of the safety risks and the problems that real people in the real world have already experienced that I can go in and look for when I'm observing these procedures. And I can say to myself, all right, if I see this happening, I really need to try and look for a root cause, whether it be asking the physician or the techs and nurses their perceived root cause, or using just observational skills to see, oh, this is where this is coming from. Again, we're deciding on ethnography, so sort of a long format generative research where we're going into the OR and standing in the corner and staying out of the way, but trying to really capture as much of the goings on in there as we can. We're going to say we have 8 cases to observe for this particular study, kind of on a combination of budget, timeline, and also some of the more formative guidance procedures as well. And then I like to observe, at least in pairs, even with limited space and credentialing. I think that it would be ideal if you could fit 8 people into an operating suite, but that's pretty much never the case. So in this case, we'd have one human factors engineer as the moderator, and then bringing in an engineer or a designer to keep this multidisciplinary collaborative theme going and having them do the videography, making sure that they understand your priorities of what needs to be captured, but also allowing them to manipulate some of the video to capture things that they're interested in as well and give them that good information. So maybe we'll use a standing camera that captures the broader goings-on of the OR, kind of a wider angle, if you will. And then the designer or engineer can have something more pointed, maybe a GoPro on the end of one of the sticks that they provide to really get, not over the sterile field, but closer to it, and to show the details of maybe someone working with the tool itself or the cart system that's associated with it, if there is one. We'll have the note-taking guide basically include layouts like a grid or a table perhaps for task order, spaces to sketch the environmental layout, and also space to record just interactions and observations. So I think in ethnography, the less detail you have in your guide as far as the observations, the better, because oftentimes things are not what you predict they are. And when things go sort of against expectation and your guide is highly structured, you run into problems trying to flip through pages, get to the right spot. So sometimes it might actually be better to spend, give yourself a little more freedom in advance. And for this, we'll say that we're going to report with something highly visual like a PowerPoint presentation, because I think that oftentimes too many words, it's hard to describe all of the things that happen in complex scenarios. So we like to rely a lot more on video clips and photographs to pair and support and emphasize a lot of our findings and conclusions. All right. So an example of a database that you might create, which is something, this is how you might transfer your data from the moderator's guide into the computer, or if you have the ability to take notes on the computer in the moment, that's great. I like to color code things, maybe having each row be their own participant, where you have vascular surgeons, surgical assists, and circulating nurses or circulating techs all along this. And then if there are interview questions prior, try to color code those differently. Anything that can visually create a distinction for you between different phases, different tasks, or different occurrences is great. So this is just sort of an example that you might think about using as you organize your data, which we'll get to in a little bit. So this is the part that I want to slow down a little bit on and kind of dive into, because I think that there are so many ways to go about this. Qualitative data especially gives you lots of freedom, but with that freedom can come ambiguity, and that can be a huge time suck. And we don't always have time in our industry, as I'm sure you can all relate to. So the first thing is, I know that this is a pain for a lot of people, but always budget time for scrubbing and organizing your data, including photo and video review. If someone asks you how long the research is going to take and how long the report's going to take, add a week in between those two things, just so that you can really immerse yourself in the data and understand, everything you can about it and have it in a good place to be able to share. It's good data etiquette to make sure that if you for some reason leave the company, or if you get assigned to a different project and have to hand it over, someone else is going to have to comb through this stuff, and it is going to be a nightmare for them if you don't kind of go through and make things usable. We're making the product usable, we might as well make our data usable as well. So structure a data sheet that allows for easy transfer. As I said, I gave you the example just a couple minutes ago, columns, make sure that everything is distinct. And a good example, I think I can go back a little bit here. So you have any observations, so you can put down quotes here, you could put down, I'm talking about column E here if you can't see my arrow. Really, that's sort of a free-form space to type down. Oh, they use their left hand to do this, or this required 2 hands every time. And then something really quick and dirty, just a Y or an N throughout this column. Did this user have problems with this task? Yes? No? Little things like that can make it very simple. It summarizes the potentially very complex and lengthy data that you put into the observation column, so that when you're going through your data, maybe a couple weeks later, you can go through and go, oh, there's an issue I need to write about. Oh, wow, no one had any trouble with this at all. So it kind of allows for a quicker summary later on. And in addition, let's see here. It's important to look out for buzzwords. A great example is once your data are all collected and you've typed everything up and you have a ton of data in the spreadsheet, or even in your notes, once you're electronically in Word or Excel, it's great if you can just use count if functions or even sort of Control F to find things in Word. I usually look for things like tough, hard, difficult, things that might come through quotations, or if I know that for instance, my write-up of observations is, I say only did this or couldn't do that, I might just look up couldn't to see. So it doesn't have to be fancy programming. It can just be something as simple as looking for themes and identifying them. And once you identify them, it's great to color code and sort of earmark in any way you can key findings and quotes, and do this as you go. Because if you set aside, okay, I'm going to organize it all and then I'm going to come back through and do this, it adds a lot of time. So if, as you're familiarizing, scrubbing, organizing the data, you find something that you think might be worthwhile to report on, change the font color, highlight it, make a little comment, anything that you can do in the process to bring your attention back to this piece later on, you're going to thank yourself later. And then reviewing for clarity and consistency of terms. I think that that's one of the things that I find most difficult, because a lot of people use different language for different things, whether it's physicians or even internally. The engineers might call one part of the device something, and the designers and human factors people might be calling it something else, just based on technical background. So if you can kind of go through and make sure that when people are referring to, let's say, a sheath versus a guide, those two things might be the same. So choose one and try to keep it similar across your data, and especially in your report, because if you're presenting to an audience who doesn't know things as well and they see sheath and guide and you don't tell them they're interchangeable, they might be very confused about some of your findings and conclusions. And everyone's least favorite and potentially favorite, spell check. This actually, the reason I emphasize spell check, especially in Excel databases, is because it allows worry-free copy and pasting. You can take it right from Excel and slap it into PowerPoint or Word without having to go back and comb through later. And then if you're providing other people, whether it be clients or someone else who's internal to your company, with the data, then they won't have to wonder, well, did you mean the word like or the word link? So you can keep things pretty clear. And then in addition to scrubbing, I think the scrubbing is a little bit different than organizing. Once the data are scrubbed, it becomes a lot easier to organize. So it's important that we try to separate or group any data that you plan to filter. And again, I think that qualitative data is more difficult and it's more time consuming to filter it. So this is a key step here. There are a couple different things that we've done in the past at Farm, but one of my favorites, even though it's a little time consuming, is sticky note transcribing. So I'll take my moderator's guide. Let's say I'm not even in the computer at this point, or I'm taking an Excel spreadsheet if I am in the computer, and I'll write key things, maybe all the things that I turned a certain color, I'll write them on sticky notes. Super pithy, 3 to 4 words, and then start grouping them. And I'll color code them, with different colored sticky notes. Find a board or a war room in your company and just cover the walls and make sure that you can physically see, which things belong together. And I think that this is, it's great to do this physically, because you can bring other people into the room and it helps you to really dive deep into your data. And I think that's one of the best ways that I've become able to familiarize with the data even more, even if I were the one collecting it. And being familiar leads to more productive reporting and descriptions later on. And then, simply column or row isolation. So I showed you earlier the column for observations and then just the yes/no usability column. That's really important, where you don't have 2 tasks that are under the same column if you want to distinguish between them later on in either your task analyses or even your report. So if there are 2 things that are different, make them 2 different rows, make them 2 different columns, whatever works for you, given your questions, your format, and your research. And another more recent development is tabs in OneNote. I find that if you can take things thematically and label them electronically, it's basically, the electronic version of a binder with subject separators. And that can be a really valuable piece of data organizing and analysis tools. And then even if you're a startup, if you're kind of working on a scrappier system, use Google Docs. There are plenty of free and incredible technologies and apps out there that allow you to kind of keep a savvy organization as you go. And then organize, when you're saying, well, what do I organize by? As I said, maybe tasks. So if there are distinct motions or things you want to think about as critical or essential tasks way later down the line in ethnography, and you're trying to define tasks, try to keep those separate. But also theme. For instance, people are handling, maybe like grip is one thing. So if you take your photos, you might want to organize your photos by grip. So you can take a bunch of pictures of how did people hold on to this device. Alternatively, you might be events. So is it tubing management? Or is it when the tubing is opened, so opening packages? So the more that you can organize your data, again, the more easier it will be to draw conclusions from it. And then also video clips. As you go through, if you see a video clip that you're reviewing, just snag it, whether it's with some Adobe tools or some of the free tools that are out there. Sort of take little pieces of the videos as you can and embed them in PowerPoint to emphasize, again, more of your themes. And also coding and filtering your data. So I use dummy codes all the time. They're a great way to put a false numeric value onto different subjects, for instance, in qualitative data. So you might say, in this case, that 0 and 1 is just positive or negative. So 0 is things where they say, the question is, how reliable or unreliable do you find the current system? And if they found it unreliable, you say 0, and if they found it reliable, you say 1. That's a subjective code, but it helps you to organize yourself. Similarly, if you say, if you could change one thing, what would it be? And their response is a qualitative, maybe the power chord or the graphics or the grip. Then you can organize by your dummy code. Just do a sort function in your Excel database, and suddenly you have all the comments about graphics together, all the comments about grip. And so it's a quick and easy way to put things together without having to sift through. And I think this might go without saying, but I think that it's worthwhile to remember that we're crafting a narrative. It's a story. Data on their own are dry, and if you don't sort of create a cohesive structure around which to present your data, your audience isn't going to glean nearly as much as they could than if you really gave them scaffolding and a path through which to travel as they sift through all the information that you're providing. But again, maintain transparency. Even though you might be summarizing or representing things, it's really key to say, yes, this is the summary of what happened, or this is what I have concluded. But for those who care, I kind of think it's like some people will want more details. I can't say enough about appendices and having the granular nitty-gritty details there for anyone who wants to find them. So don't take those away, but don't necessarily make them the focus of your reporting. So I like to think about ethnography as a really visual experience because it is observational, and it's hard to observe when you're reading a report. I think that the reporting should mirror as best it can the method that you use to collect. And so in this case, I think it's great to rely on visuals whenever possible, but always remember that, don't make things visual at the cost of comprehension. If you can't really get something across without words, don't ignore them, don't avoid them, don't run away from them. But filter up when you can, discuss patterns or themes rather than detailing each case. And as I said, just keep those cases and the how you got there and sort of the proof, if you will. The data are your proof, and you can keep those towards the end. Again, maybe in appendices. Finally, I also think executive summaries are your friend. And I say executive summaries because the report itself is a summary, and otherwise it would be extremely long and really difficult to navigate. So I think that an executive summary is yet another level of detail higher up that allows people to get a sense for what they're about to experience. So if you begin a report with an executive summary, then it can take people with different levels of interest or different levels of time available and still get your points across. But don't make your audience work too hard. Tell them what the findings mean. So it's great to say, here's what we found, here's what we found, here's what we found. But if you don't tell them, and here's what it means for you, which you kind of did all that work up front to begin with to find out what do people want it to mean and what do they want to find out, you're doing yourself a disservice because they're not going to make that conclusion always on their own. And then this is a big one for me. My background is cognitive and neuroscience, and so I always like to remind people that users, all humans in general, are bad at metacognition, which is awareness of your own thoughts, ultimately. So when you're discussing findings, even if it's the world's best surgeon, even if it's a wonderful, key opinion leader, a thought leader, any expert you can find, try not to take their opinion as law. So qualitative data involves a lot of quotations and perceptions, but perceptions can be inaccurate, and people are fallible. We all are. So I think it's really important that we all understand that while a quote may be extremely effective or a person's opinion might be quite strong, try to differentiate using your objective observational data between real needs and perceived needs for users, and that can really make a difference. Some people will test a product later on and the user will say, I didn't even realize I wanted this, but thank you for including it. And that's where that objective observational evidence comes in. So I'm going to go through a few series. This is going to be quite visual for the remainder of just examples of how you can show different types of data in a way that doesn't have you describing things over and over again. So one example is diagramming. So in an OR, there's a lot of different variations, but sometimes there are a lot of good similarities as well. And so here we have one comparison of two different layouts that are sort of concatenation. So this is one representative example of a larger OR layout. And then here is a sort of tighter space, different equipment setup that you might find in maybe a smaller hospital or a smaller suite. And so these aren't necessarily one-to-one representations of environments that you experienced, but it's a good way to show some people have more space than others. And here's what that means for both workflow in motion and availability. Real estate is always what people are fighting for with their medical devices. Similarly, to summarize really high-level findings, right? So opportunity areas are a great way to do this. You can take the space, turn it into an illustration, and start labeling things and say, here's where we can be better here. Here's where, this is a complaint for them. So a great place to show user needs as well. And this is, I think, great to be in executive summaries because in a small space, in a single slide, you have a very detailed but yet still pithy and concise conveyance of your data. And then if you happen to have the capabilities, whether with engineers, designers, or yourself, modeling is a great way to show environmental and even device-specific factors. So here we have potential safety or operator issues called out, usability issues, something that wastes time where it might not be this critical problem, but it's an annoyance and it certainly decreases efficiency. So I think that, and differentiating even between patient safety and operator safety. Not that one is certainly less valuable than the other, but just to specify very quickly. So now once people are familiarized with this legend or this key up here, they can quickly see, oh, in this part of the environment, let's say the operating room, here are some of the problems that you might encounter. And I think that because you use this key and legend in the model, again, it's a summary, it's concise, it's pithy, but it's also saying the so what, right? So you could say, if you didn't have this image, this yellow triangle down here, you could say, well, this button is easy to press accidentally, but then what does that mean? Well, what it means, according to this icon, is that there's a potential safety issue for the operator. And that's kind of a great way to really combine visual information and nuanced content in a way that's easily digestible to your audience. And then even thinking about the combination, you're often collecting quantitative data along with your qualitative. And even though this particular presentation focuses on the quantitative is always there as well. But sometimes that might not be the point. It might not matter necessarily the absolute time that's being used, but maybe the relationship between different times. So what this chart shows is each row here is a different vascular surgeon, and each color is a different step in the workflow. And it shows both length in the physical length of the bar and step differentiated by color, as well as the order. The order of steps is also here. So you might see this step is being done first by surgeon 1 and second by surgeon 2 and 5. And this can help you just very quickly get a sense of how similar or how different are workflows, and are there patterns you can identify that would, significantly shorten workflows. So it looks like people who do this step S later on in the workflow have much faster experiences doing it. So maybe it would behoove you as a researcher to recommend or rearrange the instructions to suggest that step F be completed as a third or second step. So little things like that. And if you wanted to combine, actually include data labels to show, well, maybe the absolute time does matter, because who knows if this is seconds, minutes, or hours. So you could use this endpoint here to say, total case time. And you could even within each of these squares, if it didn't get too crowded, or if you wanted to focus on one particular task, let's say these darkest green step Qs here, you could label only step Q with how long each physician took during that step to really emphasize your point. I wouldn't recommend having a summary slide like this that had time in every single color across the board all at once, because that would get very hard to digest. So if you're talking about step Q and you want to focus on step Q, only label step Q. And again, that's just a way to keep your readers interested and focused. Another thing that you can do as a researcher is to summarize quotations or subjective information like perceptions by assigning ratings to them. So for instance, you might say, users are saying, I really like the device feature. It's really important to me that comfort be very high, that the grip is easy to use, and I'm holding this thing for 3 hours, so it makes a lot of sense that I would want to really have a good, easy, and comfortable grip, and it needs to be responsive. And then you go into the OR, you do your research and observation, and then you see that, in fact, the comfort and grip are pretty low when you talk to participants and look at their quotes, but you notice that, they find them pretty safe. They said, yeah, I think it's pretty safe, or I think that it's balanced nicely, like I don't feel like I have to hold it up too much. And so you might find there's a dissonance between the subjective desires of participants and the actual performance of the device. And that you can decide based on those dissonances or those discrepancies how you'd like to move forward, again, keeping in mind whether perception and reality are valid as far as the user thinking they need something that they may or may not need. So when do we start to quantify the qualitative? I think this is a good question in general, but I like to leverage frequency data within qualitative patterns, but selectively. So you don't want to say, 6 nurses did this, 8 doctors did that, 2 techs did this, when it doesn't really mean anything. You want to use it when you're saying, hey, this worked great, everybody could do it, or wow, only 2 of our 8 technologists were able to transfer the device without breaching the sterile field. That's a huge risk. So when you're going to leverage numbers in an effort to be very clear about what happened and how many people were doing something, do it when it's most important and when it makes a point. Because if you sort of say 7 out of 8 did this and 6 out of 8 did that, it's really hard to say what that means. And if it doesn't mean anything, maybe don't report it. And then when quantifying qualitative data, emphasize the qualitative content. So highlight what happened and then support it with how often. So in the example above of only 2 of the 8 technologists were able to transfer without breaching sterile field, rather than just saying 2 of 8. So by putting only in there, it's very simple, but you're then sort of emphasizing, well, it was the fact that, it was this many, and then making sure that you're ending, you could even start with, as far as sterile field breaches, you could say the sterile field was breached if you wanted to use the passive voice, by 6 of the 8 technologists. So depending on what angle you're taking, you can take that one sentence and recraft it to emphasize your point in a way that says, well, what happened and what does that mean? And again, always track and link to the raw data to remind people that you are doing this in a transparent way and in a way that leaves data that have integrity. So what about words, right? I've been talking about pictures, I've been talking about numbers. Quotations are really strong, and people who make personas and user journey maps know this. To understand something from the voice of the user, is key. So don't filter your quotes. Try to avoid, say, if someone says, this thing ain't got nothing I can hang on to, don't change that. Don't say, user 2 reported that the device had nothing onto which you should hold. That's not the same. And I think that if you want to make a punch and make a point, put it, the user's words are going to be more powerful than your scientific writing oftentimes, especially for early use cases like ethnography. I don't know what I'd do if my nurse couldn't work the damn software. That's conveys a tone as well, a frustration that doesn't come across if you just say, well, the surgeon wasn't as adept at the software, so the nurse had to use it. But again, keep it concise, because words are only as effective as you make them. So when you're doing your reporting, any words that you use should get to the point and get there quickly, especially in things like PowerPoint. It's really easy to go and describe things all day long, but the more you describe things from your perspective, oftentimes the deeper in your own head you can get and forget what your audience is thinking, and you can lose people pretty easily. So lastly, I think we're doing pretty well on time here. What about making design recommendations, right? You asked all the questions, you did all the work. Now it's time to really tailor your findings to the people who care about them. I don't know anyone who writes reports for themselves. For me, they're deliverables, and for internal folks, they're going somewhere. So it's important that you really keep that in mind. Insights are great, but they don't exist in a vacuum. And it's great as you're drafting the report to ask for feedback early from the people who are around you, whether it was the engineer and designer who accompanied you to the OR in our little case study, or perhaps organizing findings and conclusions based on those priorities that you gathered at the very beginning. So for instance, if you know for a fact that the designers and engineers and executives are all interested in, let's say, I don't know, cord management, which I don't know why they would be, but we'll say that's the big problem here. Then start talking about cord management up front, but really make sure that you're nesting, again, your data in a familiar structure. So if you're doing it by priority, maybe prioritize the executive summary and then have the report reflect maybe a workflow or a timeline structure. And it's okay, and I think that this is something that human factors in general, it goes back and forth on depending on where you're working. But it's okay to include specific design ideas or changes, right? So we do the work, we do the research, but we aren't necessarily designers by name or engineers by background. So do we get to say, here's what I think the device should look like? And I think the answer is yes. But especially if you're trying to inspire conversation rather than prescribe your idea as a solution. So for instance, consider altering the material or texture of the handle to increase friction for wet gloved hands, right? That makes sense. You're not saying what material to use because you're not a plastics engineer, but you're saying that there needs to be more friction to prevent something from happening. But don't leave that on its own, right? So I have this nice semicolon in here because if you dropped the device because your glove was wet and you couldn't grip it, I need to get a whole new one because it's sterile. And so don't just say, consider this because I feel like it. It's consider this because the data suggests that this is what could happen, if we don't do this design change. So keeping this, 1 or 2 sentences, but making sure you get your points across is key. And same thing, maybe if you're you're a human factors researcher, you have expertise in cognitive functioning. So create a separate button for X on top of the device rather than combining it with the button for Y. Why? Because different actions for different outcomes. So pulling from HE75, perhaps, or pulling from heuristic evaluations that you may have done, put little principles in there that show that there's more of a universal or ubiquitous reason that these design principles might be applied here. And then lastly, I think a big thing here is to advocate for your recommendations. And that doesn't mean that you should fight people and say that you're right and they're wrong, but don't slap a report on someone's desk or send it to them via email and assume that it's going to speak for itself. I like to think of researchers and reports as a package deal. Give the presentation, take the time to field questions and reach out afterwards and say, hey, it's been a couple days, maybe you've had time to digest. What are your thoughts? If you can't give a presentation, always follow up like that. Because I think that, if you don't, I don't want to use the word spoon feed, but I think if you don't make clear the intention and the actionable pieces from your report, other people may not have time, or you may not have, even no matter how skillfully you crafted the report, it may not come across exactly as you'd like it. So being there to interact and have the conversation rather than letting the report speak for you is really great. And again, when I say advocate, I don't mean fight. I think that some of the best feedback that I get is criticism on reports, and making others feel heard is great, because the next report that you have, if you don't make them feel heard, they might not listen in the first place. And then keep an eye on the big picture. I think when you're doing this research, you put so much time and effort into the data and into the research, and it's your passion, it's your job one way or another, and it's really easy to get discouraged by, well, that design idea is great, or yes, we have these data, but oftentimes, we as we should, we prioritize safety in the medical field, but providing high quality user experience is also part of human factors, and sometimes those essential task design changes take a back seat to critical tasks, and that's okay, because timelines are everywhere, nothing exists in a vacuum, right? And material costs, whether it's custom versus something off the shelf, branding principles, or boundaries that might prevent you from doing something, that all happens, and that's part of life. And my biggest thing is stick with the conclusions and the recommendations that you make. If you have an idea, put it in your back pocket, because sometimes the company or the timeline or whoever might not be ready for it, but it doesn't mean it's bad, and it doesn't mean that it won't eventually get implemented. Change can come slowly, and that's hard for a lot of us to digest. But if you know that you informed people and you gave them good information, and they're making the decision of excluding a certain feature, knowing that what you found, I think that that's a good decision in general, because everybody's on the same page as far as the information they had when they made the decision. And then inform products, improve outcomes, which I think we're all here at this webinar, so I think we all believe that. But if you take the time to research your devices, whether it's a next-gen product or a product that you're trying to fill a white space with, the more that you get in there early and try to understand the qualitative parts, then the easier it'll be to get the quantitative error rates and root causing portions to flow. So these are some of the products that Pharm has worked on that have really been the results of a lot of early stage research and a lot of work with stakeholders, and hopefully that there is a better outcome for these, happier users, safer patients, and that sort of thing. So we have about 9 minutes remaining, and so with that, I hope people are asking questions as we go, so I'll start fielding those now.
Great, thank you, Kate. Wonderful presentation. I'll give you a second to take a sip of water.
Thank you.
First question here. Great content, thanks. Will the slides be made available? That's pretty low-hanging fruit. Yes, we will make the slides available, as well as we recorded the webinar, so you'll be able to go back and watch this as well and listen in. And you'll see on the screen there's Kate's email. That means I assume she's available for any questions that might arise. Is that correct, Kate?
Yes, that's correct.
Here's a question on data collection. How do you make sure that during the data collection you don't become biased? Is there a way to prioritize or not prioritize the data during that data collection period?
That's a fantastic question. I'm always interested in biases, especially, again, if you're bringing designers in, maybe it's the designer or engineer who actually designed the product that you're now criticizing, and that's always a fun one. But I think that in the moment, the objective photographs and video are the way to go. And if you write down in your notes, this was terrible or this was excellent, no problems here, double check yourself and put a little asterisk next to things that you think are opinion, as opposed to, so there's a difference, right, between saying no problems with this task, which is opinion, versus, used one-handed without second-hand, time went, accomplished quickly, right? So I think that if you go back through your notes and you notice yourself saying things that seem less detailed or a little bit more subjective, go into the data sheet or go into the videos that you've taken or look at the photos and say, is this true? What was my perception of the reality matching what I recorded in either audio or video?
Great. Is there any periodicals or journals that you keep up with in your field that perhaps our attendees might need to be aware of?
Yes. So the APA Division 21 is a periodical that comes out with human factors and usability-centric research articles. They're all academic articles, but a lot of them are very applied in their subject matter. And I found that those have been excellent for things like team cognition. Healthcare and emergency response is often a really hot topic among those publications. And so you can get some really top-notch researchers. Frank Drews, who does a lot of medical work, everyone from Wickens, Strayer, all those sorts of folks are really out there.
Excellent. Well, if there's any more questions, submit them now, or perhaps email Kate offline. Oh, there is a question here. I'm sorry. Can you just repeat the name of that publication again, please?
Oh, absolutely. So APA, which is the American Psychological Association, has different divisions. And Division 21, I believe, is the applied human factors-esque. I think it's like applied engineering psychology or something of that sort. There's also a good cognitive aging division. So if you go into the American Psychological Association, they have all these different divisions, and there's several different subdivisions that they publish regularly. I think it's quarterly. I believe I used to get it in my mailbox all the time. That you might be very interested in, in general for current psychological theory, both basic and applied.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Kate, and thank you to FARM, and thank you to all of our attendees today. As we said, this presentation will be made available on our website, and we will be sending out a link to the full recorded webinar. Thank you, Kate.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you. Have a good day, everybody.
Bye-bye.
How do I end this?
All right, so we're good.